Good evening. My name is Joe Sam Robinson. It's my pleasure to have with us tonight once again Dr. Buck Melton. Welcome, Buck.
Well, at least this time you didn't call me the Sage of Macon.
No, I let the audience choose the right term of praise for you. I'll let them be neutrally do a neutral assessment.
But we could talk about another sage, the Sage of Monticello.
Let's do that.
Or Monticello, should I say.
Monticello, yeah, there's a different way. So the country is lurching into the future. It's had a troubled past. It's had bright spells in its history. It's done great things. And one of the architects of the country's journey into the world is Thomas Jefferson. Mm-hmm. And there are many good things and many bad things one could say about him, mostly good things. Well, I'll start off by asking you to think of some bad things. We'll have no trouble thinking of some good things.
I have no trouble thinking of bad things.
All right.
So it works. Now, I will say, I do recognize Jefferson's contribution to America. He is one of the top two or three of the founders. And of course, one of your alma mater, his gravestone, founder of the University of Virginia, is one of he did not put President of the United States on that. But that being said, no man is a hero to his valet. We've all got skeletons, we've got problems. So the things that I've always had a problem with about Jefferson is that he's sanctimonious, he's hypocritical, he's a liar. He lies, perhaps he even deceives himself more than he deceives other people. And he can be very, very petty. And as a friend, I would characterize him as a false friend and a backstabber.
Wow. Well, who did he backstab?
His good friend John Adams, and I am an Adams fanboy as well.
Okay,
so from long ago, I almost want to preempt this and make this the John Adams show tonight.
Well, we can discuss John. And his wife.
Yes, John and Abigail, who are, the great, I think, the great romance in American history. And another thing, I'm feeling my spleen tonight. That whenever people refer to the Kennedys as America's royalty, I want to say we're America. We don't have royalty.
Just so. We have would-be royals.
Yes. and if you wanted to hold up a family as being the best of America, it would clearly be not the Kennedys, but the Adams family. And by that I don't mean. I mean the family that was founded by John and Abigail.
Yes.
So, but enough of that. We'll do an Adams episode later.
Well, let's back to Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
So he was mean to John Adams.
Yes.
And I think there was some controversy about the being president and that sort of thing.
Oh yes.
With John Adams. Can you recollect some of those details?
Well, yes, and I think the thing is that Adams and Jefferson formed this wonderful partnership and friendship during the Continental Congress, Second Continental Congress, and they were polar opposites. They were original Mutt and Jeff. Adams was flamboyant, he was short, he was passionate, he was talkative, he was vain. Jefferson was tall and lanky and red-haired and almost painfully shy, not a public speaker in any sense of the imagination. And yet they shared this hatred of England. They had this vision for America. And other than George Washington and perhaps Benjamin Franklin, they were the two men who were responsible for winning our independence.
Now, you use a strong word, hatred. They're both of substantial English descent.
Yes.
And they were imbibed in they imbibed the whole British civilization.
Yes.
Why such a hard word to hate?
You'd have to ask them, but I think they believed that they were steeped in English history. They understood, I think, the Restoration and the English Civil War and the English Bill of Rights better. Really, they took it to heart more than the English themselves did by the 1700s. And they knew, or at least believed, that the English were not being true to that. And Jefferson at one point said, "I'd give everything to see the entire island of England sink in the ocean." I don't think Adams hated it that much. And I actually think that that was one of the causes of the rift between them, that they were brought together by a common enemy. And once the common enemy had been defeated and America had achieved its independence, they began to realize that their visions of America were not the same. And this is what led them to join and largely be founders of, although Hamilton was the main founder of the Federalist Party, led them to these two different parties with these different takes on what America ought to be. And then in the 1790s found themselves in competition to be George Washington's successor president. And it was during that campaign that Jefferson actually paid, in two different campaigns, both 1796 and 1800, paid newspaper editors of his ideology, of his bent, to engage in character assassination against his good friend Adams on the sly. He worked through these cutouts, and then when he was challenged about having done that, he lied about it. And it was not until Adams had left the presidency himself in the early 1800s the whole story came out. And when that happened, Abigail wrote him first because she and Jefferson were also great friends. They were great family friends. John Quincy Adams had traveled with Jefferson, had been his personal secretary, had learned from him. But when the news of this came out, Abigail wrote him and just ripped him to shreds. And Jefferson just responded with this kind of befuddled, well, what did I do? I mean, so.
Well, I won't get too much into this.
Yes.
Lie is a strong word, just like hatred is. You don't think he was dissembling? Well, maybe I might have done it. It was, and then it was the common species of the time. I mean, certainly Jefferson was assassinated. If you were, and indeed, maybe that's just the way the political world went.
Yes, but it just seems like you wouldn't do that to somebody as close to you on so many different levels.
Unless it was part, I mean, it's hard for us to judge several hundred years later. Maybe that was part of the game, but maybe it wasn't. I mean,
to jump ahead, I must say, somebody else you've been working on, Woodrow Wilson,
yes,
classic progressive. And it is said of, I think it was said of Wilson in particular, but also of progressives in general, they love humanity, but they hate people.
Yes.
And that's the thing, when you are so wedded ideologically to a movement, individuals become expendable.
Yes.
And Jefferson made no bones about this. He said that, well, I'm sorry all these children were killed in the French Revolution by the guillotine, but
yes,
it served a greater purpose. And so, he was willing to stab his friend Adams in the back for the purpose of American Whiggery or something like
well,
that. So.
I mean, it's pretty complicated about motivation and different ways of looking at the world, deductive reasoning or whatever. So we have one great apex principle,
yes,
and then everything else is secondary to that. I just judge good and evil by how successfully I accomplished this great mission, and of course that's the real door. That's the open door to evil. So you can say almost any terrible Holocaust in human history, somebody has thought, well, I'm doing this for a higher reason.
Yes.
It's not capricious. I'm really sort of a good person.
And
I'm
in
just
doing so, they
killing
become
everyone or whatever.
But in doing that, they become what they behold. I mean, you remember Winston in 1984 when the supervisors asking, "What are you willing to do to bring down Big Brother and result in liberty? Are you willing to lie, to cheat, to kill, to rape?" And Winston saying, "Yes, yes, 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 yes." And it's like, checkmate. You are what you're trying to destroy. Don't get all sanctimonious with me. So.
Well, we get into some ethical issues here. Let me just take the conversation back a little bit to why the two might have hated England. Do you think it had an economic underpinning? Like Jefferson found himself episodically in debt. The whole Virginia planter aristocracy was constant, even though they had a lot of land and indeed unfortunately, I don't know what the right word is, they had many slaves, but the amount of money they actually had wasn't so great. They were in debt constantly to the London, and so point number one, sort of an economic issue, and then one might say about Adams is in the Boston mercantile world, and they had different kinds of regulations and laws that put them as sort of second-class people, and they certainly did not consider themselves that. So they were American, for better words, certainly for Jefferson, an American aristocrat, an extremely wealthy person. I mean, the zillionaire, inheriting tremendous amounts of wealth and never having to consider, other than at a polite distance, what the little people were up to. And Adams is a very bright guy. He's in Boston. He's jumping around, and obviously the regulations and competing with London was difficult, going back and forth. And any interchange with the Brits, they were thought of second-class citizens. George Washington, for instance, one of his big deals was he wanted to be a British officer, and he was not at the right stripe. You weren't going to let a colonialist do that, and so he felt abashed by that. And some of those interchanges were there, but Marxian comments on that about the inevitability of a transatlantic disruption.
Yes.
Because of economic circumstances.
Yeah. I will address that, but another aside regarding Jefferson and Hamilton, it's very interesting how they were polar opposites, because, as you say, Jefferson was the closest thing to American aristocracy that we had at that point. He inherited wealth, he had a lot of land, but he always talked a common man kind of game, whereas Hamilton, born in the West Indies in very modest circumstances, built himself up and took on the airs of an aristocrat.
And I pursued wealthy women, I guess.
Yes, and so I think and held himself out as aristocracy when he wasn't. So fascinating.
One other comment I might just throw out there is particularly in that culture, the idea of being a warrior or being a soldier was the summa bonum. I mean, why would you not fight? That was your responsibility to actually take a pistol and shoot people and risk your life. And Hamilton did that. I mean, we could say that. And unlike these other figures, I'm trying to think how old Jefferson was at the start of the Revolution.
Well, he was born in 43. Very good.
I think he was around then.
Yeah.
And then
very young.
Adams also could have been
35. He was born in 35, I believe.
Well, still, that would have been a reasonable thing to have taken up arms instead of bovating, to use that word, sitting around. Well, let's talk about the philosophy of this. And of course, I'm not really risking it. I guess the Brits might hang me, or maybe I could get to France. Maybe they won't hang me.
Yes.
I can find a way to escape. I'm risking a lot, but not on the battlefield. Any comments about that?
Well, I mean, somebody's got to do those jobs. You know, I give Adams a pass, and probably Jefferson as well. But yeah, Adams did undertake several very hazardous voyages in the name and on the business of the United States. He could have been intercepted by the superior British Navy. He could have just drowned. So there are different ways of laying it on the line for your country. And had any of those signers of the Declaration been caught, they would have been probably summarily executed. I mean,
probably, maybe, or at least go to the Tower of London. I think who was there? Henry Lawrence was there.
Yes, so
they put him there.
Yes,
you can see where his cell was if you visit the Tower of London.
So,
yes, go ahead.
But back to your original discussion. The way the mercantilist system was set up was almost guaranteed to result in, over time, a flow of money from the colonies into England, and there was really no way the colonies could win the game, and they were even okay with that as long as they could go outside the system and smuggle. And speaking especially of the mercantilist circles in which Adams moved, that all those folks. I mean, John Hancock, we hear, he's best known for the wonderful flourishing signature. Well, he really made his claim to fame by being one of the preeminent smugglers of New England. And
kind of like the Kennedys.
Yeah, there you go. Joe Kennedy, who is telling Churchill, the British are going to fold, we can't, or he's telling Roosevelt, the British are going to fold, we can't do it. And meanwhile, he's getting all the whiskey out that he can.
Get out to sell.
Yes. So the American Revolution ultimately was a result of the smugglers getting their noses put out of joint, that England's starting to enforce the laws against them. It's not very patriotic.
A few comments on this. Actually, the democracy, whatever, the American Revolution, there were relatively few people that were in the you can vote kind of gang. There were no bonds people were there, and very few Native Americans, no women, and then there was a strong property requirement. And then if you were able to cast a vote, the power of the local government was pretty de minimis.
Yes.
So it was kind of the whole issue. A lot of the words that were tossed out were pretty Olympian words, and under those circumstances, let me ask this question. What about allegedly a third of the country were loyalists, about a third were neutral, about a third were, quote, on the Patriot Party. Did the families or friends of each of these people, particularly Jefferson, did they go on the other side? Benjamin Franklin's famously son was governor of New Jersey, which is maybe a common story. So what sort of social risk, if I could ask that question, or ruptured friendships, would it have been an easier thing to have been neutral, which many people attempted to do? Probably, particularly people with property and things to lose. Well, let's see, they could sit and think about it. Well, I don't know here. Those patriots have got an idea here. It's pretty rash to do this. Why don't we compromise? Comments?
Well, Machiavelli would have said staying neutral in a situation like that's probably the worst thing to do, because you'll incur the hatred of whoever wins for not joining in. If you look at the Carolina upcountry, especially South Carolina, North Carolina, families did split apart up there. It turned into a little miniature civil war.
Yes.
Things got kind of nasty as well. So yes, it was definitely very divisive there.
And I may burden the audience with a slight personal story, but it's a law which I'll cut to the short. I mean, there's an amusing event or story came to me about one of my ancestors, and actually, I'm sure we were patriotic and were fighting for the new America, and in fact, a number of relatives did. But one of them, at least, was in North Carolina, and where there was a raging civil war, and each side was fighting with the other, and he joined a regiment being sent to Yorktown to fight with Lord Cornwallis. So he was there. This is Richard Robinson, an ancient relative many years ago, and George Washington fired to open the siege. The Brits were trapped there. He fired a 14-pound cannonball into the British lines at about 5:30 in the afternoon. And by 9 o'clock, my relative had deserted and gone over to the American side. I don't know the story after that, but certainly it was not it was a complicated period with a lot of different opinions and a lot of barbarous behavior on both sides. And one little thing about Yorktown was, happy for him he did that, because when the revolutionaries captured Yorktown, they sent all of the captured Brits on sort of a death march into the backcountry.
Yeah.
And many of them starved or were frozen to death in the winter. So it was not exactly a pleasant event.
Yes.
I'll throw that out if you've been captured by the good guy Americans. Well, we've talked about around the bush a little bit about Jefferson, and I started by asking, what can you think that's bad about him? Well, so all these good things, a whole list of good things. Well, one obvious other bad thing before we get into the good things, were all the slaves that he owned and what happened to them after his death. And I think that he'd been such a bad financial manager that they were, and it's sort of too complicated for me to get into, but I know that to pay the debts off at Monticello, they were all went on the auction block. And George Washington tried to do something about this. And whether rightfully or wrongly, you could say, well, maybe there was, with Sally Hemings, maybe there was a sexual molestation of his bonds people. There's a rather complicated story about the pros and cons of that event. But in any event, I think he recognized the terrible situation and the contradictions that were there in all his very high-flown rhetoric, which is quite a story, isn't it? I mean, one of the major contradictions of the American Civil War was the Americans were saying, well, we want freedom, and they also, because slavery was close to them, would say, well, we're not slave, we refuse to be slaves or whatever, even though they were the beneficiaries of a lot of forced bondage. So that's sort of some complicated thing. Can you probe that before we get into some more obvious things? Sure. Can you probe Jefferson and
yes? Well,
that contradiction.
The issue of slavery seems to be bothering more people now today than it has been since the end of the Civil War, which is I think interesting. It's causing us to revisit things and remove Confederate monuments. Just a few weeks ago, not only did they remove a monument, that they dug up the general who was buried under it and exhumed him. But we have to remember that prior to the Enlightenment, prior to roughly the 1600s or so, slavery was ubiquitous. I mean, throughout the world.
And for a long time thereafter.
And it was predominantly not race-based. Now here in the Americas, it's been race-based, but I'd say the vast majority of people living today have some slaves somewhere in their lineage because it was just ubiquitous. Right. There. What you start seeing in the Enlightenment is this profound discomfort. The idea of the equality of all people. And it just didn't jibe. And so Jefferson is a classical Enlightenment figure. So on the one hand, he writes that famous phrase, "All men are created equal," and yet he owns his fellow human beings and refuses to let them go. And at the end of that document, he says, "We pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor." Well, if he really means that, why didn't he free his slaves? Well, yeah, he would have taken a huge financial hit.
Yes.
But and he said, slavery is like holding on to a wolf by the ears. You don't like it, but you don't know how to end it.
Or would he, if I could say that? I mean, so there was a time. It's a complicated issue, but in Virginia, when the tobacco trade, many people they just weren't making the money they had in the past. Cotton cultivation was, and so it was almost like a breeder state, and many people sent their bonds people into the deep South and made money on it. Yeah. And they could retire debt. They did that in different ways. But certainly he did not, and I'll make another comment about that, he did not manumit his slaves. And there's an interesting person named Carter.
Robert Carter,
right,
of Nominee Hall.
Right, and he was the son of King Carter, or grandson, or whatever, King Carter, and he manumitted all his slaves. And when that happened, there was a lot of resistance against that because people didn't like it. And indeed, just to go through this, I think it might have actually been illegal to do that. It would be, it's a complicated story, but the state government made an effort to not let people do it. So and there could be, just defending Jefferson slightly, well, I could send everyone down to Mississippi. Their situation is better here. I'm not making any money particularly on it, but at least, the environment is better than it could be under other circumstances. And I don't think everything happened until he was dead. And and I think he understood some of those contradictions, which is a really fundamental. If you look at the weave of American history and the character of whatever and the ideals, City on the Hill, all of that, just that is a fundamental issue that Jefferson, the life of Jefferson, demonstrates.
And you make a good point about that, the use of rhetoric. So you take Patrick Henry's famous statement, "Is life so dear or peace so sweet as to be purchased at the price of change and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God." So
yes.
I haven't checked, but I'm sure Henry was a slave owner. So, when you put it in that context, I'm a free man. I'm better than those people. I'm not to be equated with those people, with those slaves.
Yes.
Don't confuse me with them. So it's still
it was a strong rhetorical point, if you wanted. And indeed, the Brits made that point too. We never, whatever their big song, we never free, whatever their big. We're Englishmen, we'll never be slaves, or whatever their patriotic song.
Yes.
Well, just so those are contradictions that are there, and just to push Jefferson, he's got his good points, his bad points. Apparently, he had a high, squeaky voice. Apparently, he was a terrible orator. Maybe he was a little timid. I don't know what his girlfriend's situation was, but pretty tragic death of his wife 10 years into the situation. He was an extreme intellectual, and maybe a little obsessive compulsive. If you go to Monticello, you see his book collection, which is or the way that he treated life. He wanted temperatures. I want to have everything organized and controlled as much as possible.
Yes.
And indeed, his books. I often, when I visit someone, I look at the books they have. If just a portion of his library was this extraordinary, and he read, wrote letters, thought, was a real philosopher in this isolated place on the mountain. It's altogether a rather unusual, curious personality that had a lot of good qualities, which we haven't had time to get into much. He participated in 2 revolutions. He was a torch in a dark age, you could say. He saw the necessity for these extraordinary changes in human control mechanism, which in a way, if you're defeating autocracy and aristocracy, a control mechanism that he saw wasn't going to work across in North America. So
yes.
he pioneered the change on that.
Yes, and he was a prodigious talent. And of course, getting back to the Kennedys, the very famous quip when John F. Kennedy he held a dinner of Nobel laureates, and he said, "This is the greatest collection of intellect the White House has ever seen, except when Thomas Jefferson dined alone." So yes, you can't love him or hate him. You cannot make light of his intellectual abilities and his intellectual talents. Probably took a major role in the drafting of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, which once again brings up the sort of hypocritical side of things as well. There is a fascinating book written by Leonard Levy. It's about 40, 50 years old at this point, called Jefferson and Civil Liberties, The Darker Side. And it's really fascinating because during the Cold War, when Levy wrote this book, Jefferson was one of our great heroes of the Cold War because of his beliefs in liberty. Levy wrote this takedown of Jefferson, and he was slammed by the scholarly community for doing this. How dare you mess with Jefferson like that? But almost all of these really harsh criticisms of Levy's book, all of them were ad hominem attacks on Levy. They couldn't refute Levy's arguments about how Jefferson, really acted in a very dictatorial way when he became president against his enemies. So.
Well, okay, Buck, I think our time is finished.
Indeed.
But it's great having you here, and
Thank you.
We'll talk some more about Jefferson, possibly Adams. Okay.
Look forward to it.
Thank you. Thanks.
All right.
Thank you.
This program is brought to you by the Georgia Neurosurgical Institute. For over 50 years, rendering neurosurgical care to patients of all social conditions. treating complicated problems involving the brain, spine, spinal cord, and peripheral nerves, endeavoring to encourage quality care, medical research, innovation, and education on a local, national, and international basis.